طيب بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. في البدء نترحم على أرواح الشهداء. And I want to welcome Mr. Magdi Amin. Thank you again for joining our webinar. I wanted to give some quick remarks before we start. The webinar series that we have at ASAPA, I see them as a means to an end. At the end of the day, we want to restore and maintain resilient and sustainable democracy in Sudan. So these talks are part of achieving that goal, and we want to get certain points out of every webinar as we move toward that goal. So I would encourage everyone to participate and to invite anyone that you think might help in achieving that goal by contributing to our webinars, whether as speakers or as panelists. So that said, I would like again to welcome Mr. Magdi Amin. Thank you very much. He will talk about Sudan's economic reform and HIPC, the impact of political development. Mr. Magdi Amin is a senior advisor to the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning of the Transitional Government. He worked on the program of economic reform to overcome decades of economic mismanagement in Sudan. He helped in the design and negotiation of the IMF package, including the enhanced HIPC designation, led the design and development of 1.8 billion cash transfer program, among other very significant things. So we are honored and pleased to have you here with us. We thank you again, and please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you everybody for joining. It's not easy to talk about Sudan and to deliver a presentation. You know, last week we had were disrupted by those who didn't want us to have this conversation, and now we have events on the ground that change what we need to discuss. But I think it's useful still to share the information, messages. We can discuss what are the implications going forward, and I think there's that there are a lot that we can learn from what happened, what led to the coup, what happened during the coup, how have things changed as a result of it, that maybe we can make some course corrections going forward. And let me also join you in honoring the lives of those who have lost, the 40 martyrs so far, adding to hundreds before in the struggle to finally allow Sudan and its people to have the government and the lives that they deserve. Freedom, peace, and justice. So let me start with a few summary thoughts. And because last week some of you would have seen the first few slides before we disrupted, I'll go through that section relatively more quickly. So we had made progress. A very difficult, very challenging situation. We had to demonstrate a track record of reform, and then we did qualify for HIPC. As a result of that, we had cleared arrears with the major multilaterals. Benefits weren't reaching people yet, and there were many challenges. It wasn't perfect, but it was moving very quickly. It was the largest HIPC case ever. And all of that was disrupted by the coup. So the immediate impact was the disengagement of the international community, the disruption of the extended credit facility, all of the focus on debt relief, the technical assistance. And there are big implications of that withdrawal of support, which we'll discuss. We'll then talk a little bit about the agreement that we have now and whether or not it addresses some of the key risks that the coup exposed, including the mandate needed for HIPC. And then finally, since the details are still unfolding, I think there's a need for continuous pressure, and I'll try to point to a few directions that we should focus on to make sure this transition gets back to a process that leads to productivity, job creation, and poverty reduction. Going back over some of the starting conditions, the economy was locked in a trap. A budget deficit, no domestic sources of financing, and no foreign financing. Therefore, in order to finance that deficit, and it's not a small, it was over 10% of GDP in 2019, which is it's just a very, very large amount when you consider that revenues were 4% of GDP. So the amount of money needed to be basically printed was very large, and that increase in money supply was triggering inflation. And of course, there's a weak economy, years since the transition away from the secession of South Sudan, weakened the economy, but also the politics of the region, the fact of the revolution, and the years. So this is the third year now of negative GDP growth. We were supposed to have returned to positive GDP growth this year, but because of what happened, because of the coup and the port blockade, I don't think it will happen. So now years of negative GDP growth and political instability, lack of investment in jobs, and therefore people needed subsidies, which then increased the budget deficit. And it's a downward spiral of the last years of the Bashir regime, especially after the withdrawal of the oil revenues. So the reform program was designed to intervene all of these points. So, for example, we needed to reform SOE governance, to close the budget deficit. We needed to raise revenues. We needed to reform subsidies, eventually build a domestic bond market. We needed HIPC. We needed to regain access to multilateral funding. The biggest sources of funding for developing countries is IDA, the International Development Association, the part of the World Bank that focuses on poorer countries. Countries like Ethiopia have IDA programs that are very, very large, 5 billion and more. Sudan had none of that for 30 years. So we needed to regain access. We needed to stop monetization or money printing. We needed to stabilize the economy and then start to eventually get to job creation. In the short run, we needed to move from subsidies to safety nets. Instead of subsidizing everything, everybody, whether wealthy or not, was getting very, very almost free gasoline and wheat and everything, many subsidies. But instead, we need to move to something that actually is targeted toward people who need it. So these are all part of an economic program trying to intervene this downward spiral. And as we discussed last week, some of those indicators, the big red area, that how much subsidies far exceeded, for example, health or education or any other key things that the government needs to finance. If you look at tax, this upper right graphic here, I don't know if this pointer is going to work, but this graphic here shows that Sudan's tax to GDP ratio is among the lowest in the world. And then what happened with subsidies as we started to reform, as you see the blue boxes of fuel subsidies here at close to 200% of tax revenue, we did, through the reforms, bring that down gradually in 2020, late 2020, the reforms happened. And this year, the fuel subsidies were largely withdrawn. But meanwhile, social spending as a share of tax revenue was increasing for those of a family support program and others. So that was the idea, is to actually better use the public resources, stabilize the economy, demonstrate a track record of reform, rebuild the core institutions, eventually getting to better infrastructure, the financial sector, human capital through health and education, and then finally job creation through resumption of the private sector. So this is the long path, and we were really, I'd say, focusing. We did the SMP, we then got into HIPC, and we were in the process of restructuring. And all of this, now the first part of it was not funded, except some donated grants from the Friends of Sudan. We were now in the funded part of it. We were in the process of getting funds from the IMF and the World Bank, but also African Development Bank and many others that were in the process of starting to flow. As we discussed earlier last week, we got to the HIPC process. There's a number of steps. The decision point, HIPC is the program for highly indebted poor countries. Sudan had $70 billion of external debt, far more than it could be, that it could handle, and remain current with all of the potential sources of funding. and also build its economy and focus on reducing poverty. So HIPC is basically a deal that the international community offered to 39, I believe it was 39 countries, and Sudan is the last of them, there where they support, the international community supports countries like Sudan into restructuring, and then eliminates or largely reduces debt in 2 phases in exchange for Sudan using the freed up resources from this debt restructuring to focus on poverty reduction. So the idea is that you become sustainable and then you have a little bit of fiscal space and you focus on poverty. And so we got all the way through this interim debt relief. We had agreed with the Paris Club, and now we were in the process of signing the agreements with the countries that are members of the Paris Club, and then going to the countries that aren't in the Paris Club to implement the deal we agreed. That was still in process. So in fact, before the coup, it hadn't happened. And although we did all this work, actually the debt didn't change because those agreements weren't signed yet. So basically our debt is back to 70 billion as a result of the coup. Of course, I think now that there's a political agreement, we'll see what happens next. I've sort of shared some of this already. This is the debt, the distribution of the debt between Paris Club and non-Paris Club, as well as outstanding debt to the larger donors that we needed to clear. Now that this 2.7 billion that we owe to the World Bank, IMF, and AFDB has been eliminated, and so we do have access to those resources now. But it's really the external public debt that is not now, that does need to know. We now need to go back with a political agreement to see if countries are willing to sign to the deal we agreed. And that's going to be a process that will now unfold. But as I mentioned also, we had to demonstrate reforms. So we removed the fuel subsidies, which had drained a lot of our budget. We reformed the exchange rate. We had amended the Central Bank Act. We had completed asset quality reviews of banks, and we were preparing to launch the reform process in the banking sector. We passed an anti-corruption law. We launched a family support program with lots of delays and technical difficulties, but it was reaching people, the 9 million people. So we were about a third of the way through the program targets. We were reforming the budget, focusing more on health and education and the peace of conflict-affected areas. And we had published inventories of all the state enterprises, and we're starting to work on transferring the oversight of those SOEs. We also had our poverty reduction strategy. The macroeconomic indicators started to improve, especially in the third quarter. August, we started to see inflation started to come down. Remittance flows, which is a sign of confidence, but also a result of the exchange rate reunification, went from 136 to 717 million. If you look at the first 2 quarters of last year versus this year, the current account deficit, which is the trade balance, the services balance, it's three kinds of balances, but mostly trade. That current account deficit started to disappear. So you see the 2019 full year and 2020 full year. And then if you look at the first 2 quarters of this year, we actually had a bit of a surplus in the first quarter and then a small deficit in the second quarter. So which, when we talked a lot about how do we shift from a country that's importing and consuming to one that's exporting and producing and is able to stabilize the currency, the current account deficit's a signal that we were heading in the right direction, that we were exporting more and importing less, and we were starting to, the underlying fundamentals of the economy were all going in the right direction. Inflation is still extremely high, but in addition to what we saw in August, September, it dropped further, and it would have come down even further in October, except for the port blockade, which then created shortages in the economy. We don't know exactly. I haven't seen the October figures, but it certainly would be expected not to have continued to go down. But were it not for that, we would, the end of large monetization, because I don't have a graph on it, but the budget deficit was much less than before. There was still a deficit, and let me talk to that in a second. Now, we were on the verge of starting to get a lot of money. This year, just November and December, we were expecting an IMF allocation of special drawing rights, which is an IMF currency, the dollar equivalent of what we were expecting. And in fact, the week of the coup, we were working on, the arrangements to how do you transfer money from the IMF to Sudan, about 150 million. There was a World Bank IDA electricity grant for 300 million going to the board, and then a policy loan, policy grant. All these are grants of 500 million. So we were expecting in November and early December 950 million, and it wasn't. The last policy item that needed to be done in order to qualify those 500 million was a new law for the banking sector that we just sent to the board of the central bank the Thursday before the coup. So these were done. All of the requirements to do this to get these funds were, of course, the board still had to meet, and as soon as the coup was over, everything stopped. All of the engagements of the World Bank and the IMF were halted, so that this money didn't come in. But not only were we expecting 950 million this year, next year it was more like 2 billion, just for the pipeline that we already were working on. There is 2 tranches expected of the extended credit facility, which is this program that goes alongside HIPC from the IMF. There's 7 tranches of funds that come from the IMF. The first 2 would have happened next year. There is going to be a second policy adjustment, policy grant of another 500 million. There's COVID response, data and statistics, women finance project, energy. There were actually 3 water projects in the pipeline. So we were well on the way to at least $2 billion of external support next year of projects, and all of the projects were under preparation, well underway. So that's what was sort of lost in the immediate financial. And this is, I don't have a lot of details of some of the other institutions, but because I was working closely with the fund and the World Bank's programs, this is what I'm aware of. There were, of course, bilateral donors. There's a 700 million from the US that was also stopped, and immediately they started reprogramming away from the government and towards civil society. Many other donors would have done similar things. But the immediate implications is a suspension of operations, the HIPC debt relief process halted, bilateral donors suspended support, banks cut off transactions. So European banks that were dealing with the US or dealing with Sudan all stopped. And it was very likely that we would miss the benchmarks. Now, we had an IMF mission do a sort of a preliminary review of where we stood in the weeks before the coup. Of course, we were very concerned with the political environment, but we were on track with many of our indicators. There's a couple, revenue and social spending needed to be improved, but all of the other benchmarks were looking pretty good. We had to continue that for the rest of the year, but we were now, with the port blockade and how it impacted revenue, of course, all of the benchmarks would be at risk now if the program were to continue. Now, so what did that mean? So short term, what that means is there's going to be a lot of pressure. So if you look at the averages over the first 6 months of the year, there was about 80 billion of tax revenue per month, about 12 billion of grants, since some of the large funds hadn't yet been received in the first 6 months. But expenditures, payroll was about 17 billion a month. strategic commodities about 49 billion, and there were other expenses of about 34 billion. So the government was running a deficit every month on average anyway. Then the port blockade, because a lot of the government revenues comes from taxes on imports, VAT on imports. And so had we not had an agreement that we seem to have seen today, and if the international community doesn't re-engage, every month the government would be scrambling for cash. How does it close the month? How does it meet the payroll? How does it import enough? And so there's donations of wheat, but the furnace fuel to run the electricity generation, medicine, and there's although fuel subsidies for retail, like gasoline and diesel, were eliminated, the electricity sector is still highly subsidized. That's a reform process that's still ahead of us. So they were, wasn't sure how the government would have closed the books. Basically, were the SOEs going to finally start paying substantially? We start to consolidate the gold sector and formalize it. But more likely, with limited external support, there would be a return to monetization and therefore a return to inflation. If it wasn't now, it would be soon. Probably a month or 2 months, the government would have been able to find resources, but eventually this would have caught up because you needed to. The reform process isn't over. There's still lots of work ahead. Now we have an agreement, right? But we see a contrast. These are both pictures from today. The coup leaders were facing continuous escalation, and targeted sanctions that were announced by Senator Coons, or proposed by Senator Coons, and that legislation was going forward. So they needed to stop the bloodshed and also stop the political pressure or the agreement to stop the pressure from the street. But to be sustainable, it's hard to imagine an agreement that's sustainable if the prime minister couldn't consult freely and reflect the forces that were creating that political pressure, both the resistance committees and the rest of the political forces in Sudan. And sort of all core issues needed to be on the table so that whatever agreement that happens doesn't get unraveled later. And so it's not clear, as we look at it today, was this really a authentic return to the transition where, as many people assumed, all the core issues were going to be addressed? However delayed and however flawed the process were, these issues, security sector reform and transitional justice and the parliament, et cetera, the institutions that weren't yet in place, or is this some sort of tactical or strategic retreat by the military to alleviate the pressure in the short run and then go back to a process where perhaps it wasn't heading toward the transition that we all saw and expected, but were sort of rudely awakened to not only the level of distrust between the parties, but what it seemed to be a lack of willingness to move forward with the steps that were outlined in the process. So, I can only really focus on the economic elements of this. But for one, if we look at the risks of this transition and the deal that we saw, purely from the standpoint of HIPC and that process, the government needs a strong mandate to move forward with this. To fully achieve macroeconomic stability, the target within the HIPC program actually was to get the budget deficit down toward 1.5% in 2022. That's very difficult. That's tough even for countries with stronger institutions. And so that's a hard target. Of course, it does mean that lots of grants would need to come in, and as I was discussing earlier, those grants were coming in. But at least the gap between the government's revenue and the budget expenditures needed to be closed so that the monetization and all that inflation stops, because inflation inflation hits the poor harder than anything else. And so they go to the market and prices have doubled, that's just unacceptable. And so that was a heavy focus. Implementing the poverty reduction strategy, restructuring the tax chamber and raising revenues, civil service reform, SOE reform, financial sector reform, procurement reform, debt management, creating proper management of the domestic debt and the external debt, the electricity sector, anti-money laundering, gold sector, and security sector. These are reforms that require not a sort of weak, uncommitted government. This requires a very strong government, and as weak, or strong, I don't know, we could say it either way, as difficult, as fragile as this transition was, and as problematic in some times in how things were being implemented, you can't really argue that Hamdok wasn't able to deliver these reforms that we've done so far. When you do a subsidy reform and exchange rate reform and not only survive, but sort of continue and make progress, that's because people really wanted this transition to work, and they knew that that's what it took to overcome the legacy of the Bashir regime. And this is a list of the SOEs. So these SOEs, these 10 SOEs, are the ones that were initially targeted for financial statements and audits. So that was starting to happen. Of course, that list needed to be expanded, and then proper revenues, proper oversight. So the SOE reform is a big deal, but this is just one of many. So the deal that we just saw today, one of the big risks that I worry about, and the street today does not seem to be indicating that we have the mandate. Does this government have a mandate to continue the reform process? So that's risk number one. So far, it doesn't look good, but let's, I think there's still details to be defined, and I think ultimately the prime minister will need to build support for this agreement. Two, a little bit more of a concern would be, was this a retreat, but was it really geared toward a potential return to the predatory state? So basically, the predatory state is sort of language that kind of refers to a situation where the elites in society maximize the revenue of the group in power, irrespective of its impact on the wealth of society. They focus on rent extraction, and you see this in a lot of countries that do have natural resources. So without the consent of the people or popular support, we can't reform. Then what tends to happen is that regimes turn to patronage networks or repression to stay in power despite not delivering for the people. And because markets tend not to clear, institutions remain weak, rights, property rights, security rights, how do you secure your rights in a contract, in a business transaction, or your rights just simply to go and get public services, depends on the favor of the regime. And so the only viable opportunities are those where they're sanctioned by the regime, or you have connections. So those close to the state are able to secure their rights. They become wealthy, while everyone else becomes marginalized. This is what we saw in the Arab Spring. You think of Bouazizi and what happened with him. You think about Suharto under Indonesia, Ben Ali, Egypt under Mubarak. What you end up with is narrow economies with few formal jobs, large informal sectors, huge amounts of inequality, very wealthy parts of the country, but the vast majority of the country becoming very poor, thus creating the conditions for revolution, is what we saw. And every day when I was heading to work, I would pass by this building, and for a while I couldn't really figure out what it was. And I realized it was, the security sector's club. This is a big, it's a nadi, it's an athletic club, which is really very well built, modern, very cool looking. It's fully lit up at night. But the streets in front of it, can't clear water. And you get this, I was just driving by and I saw this guy walking with his camel, clearly from the east. And just contrast for me, where everybody else, the streets, I know, Sharanil, generally they is relatively well kept, but the Khartoum, where most of the money of the economy is spent, at least from a services standpoint, is full of potholes. Public services are lacking. The healthcare, the education was all depleted over those years of the regime. And yet they had the wealth to produce clubs like this. And that's the second risk. Are we heading back to something like the predatory state, but with the temporary strategic retreat to relieve the political pressure against that? And the third one is kind of related, but it's slightly different logic or concern, which is called limited access orders. What you see in some countries and some societies, that the political system manipulates the economy to create rents as a means to preserving the peace. What you have in these situations is the state doesn't have a monopoly on violence. So there's no one army or one secure sort of one way of keeping peace. So you have fractured society and a number of elites who are capable of creating violence. Think militias. And so what happens is that the political elites divide up the control of the economy and getting some share of the rents, because violence reduces those rents. Rents here could be what's the gold sector, the oil sector, it could be just the profits of the large state enterprises or enterprises. Since outbreaks of violence reduce the rents, the elites pursue peace, but that peace is only driven by control of the rents. And in order to maintain that order, they tend to limit access and competition, therefore, and political competition, as well as economic competition. So you end up with the same sort of narrow economy. You end up with the same sort of problems of lack of broad-based growth, lack of economic justice. But it's a logic more about sustaining peace. So in addition to just pure, let's say, cronyism and corruption designed to, let's say, hold together a coalition that's enjoying those rents, the more predatory version. Here, dismantling the rents, you have to take into consideration the potential impact on peace. And the reforms were impacting the rents. So the whole anti-tamkin process, the subsidy reform, the exchange rate reform, there were lots of illegal, there were lots of corruption, there were lots of smuggling opportunities that were happening as a result of Sudan selling free fuel. They're on the borders, there's lots of money to be made by selling that free fuel at market prices in neighboring countries, for example. The same is happening with wheat still, because wheat remains subsidized. Of course, the SOEs, the transparency and the audits, the anti-corruption commission, all of these things were getting at some of those sources of rents. Now, I don't have the sort of direct evidence to say that this is exactly why anything was happening, but you see a lot of the relevance of the theory in the case of Sudan, and the fact that you do have coalitions among those who have the ability to create violence, and some of those rents are at stake. There are lots of other things going on, and some of those parties were, as a result of conflict, were marginalized and sort of have a legitimate claim to want to be part of the government and to rule for the right reasons. And I think there's a mix of everything going on. There needs to be a realization among elites, however gradually or quickly, that the economic and political gains from opening access are greater than limiting access. That's all of the support we're getting externally, the potential and the vision for what a Sudan could look like in the future and who benefits from that. But it's also action, very specific action about how do you manage and confront those rents, and building the political support for the transition. So those are the three sort of, for me, the immediate risks. Do we have a mandate? Do we have, or are we heading back toward some other form of the potential sort of, downward spirals we had before? I expect that this government is going to be asking for a resumption of international support. As we saw, the government salaries and commodity imports exceed revenues. The government needs the funds. And I worry a lot about the impact of not providing funds also on people, because some of that is commodities that, medicine that people do need. But the generals already put at risk a golden opportunity to move forward, which is HIPC. The premise, as we discussed, Sudan would reform to become sustainable. International partners provide financial support, which is some was happening, but a lot more was about to happen. Relieve Sudan's massive debt, which we had agreed. And Sudan would use the resources that got freed up to reduce poverty. We worked for 2 years on this. Lots of people sacrificed, especially by paying the higher prices. But however imperfectly, the process was working right up until the coup. What happens next? We'll have to see. But my sense is that you have to rebuild a lot of trust, and things will be different. Now we have an agreement. As I was mentioning, 3 concerns. Does the agreement give the government the mandate to confront vested interests and to deliver the reforms? Unpopular governments usually use patronage or repression. And all Sudan got out of that was a large security apparatus and including very nice clubs, conflict, trauma, economic failure, and a stolen future for its youth. So it's no wonder why they're out there in the streets. The recent events bear some resemblance to the theory of limited access orders, and so we need to pay attention to the economic incentives around peace and violence and gradually increase the incentives toward openness and competition. HIPC was associated with not only democracy, but a sustainable economy, productivity, jobs, human capital, and poverty reduction. The international community will not underwrite a process that yield patronage and repression. It will need to test core principles and make sure we're on track with a true transition and not a strategic retreat. I think the agreement that we saw today is the first step. I think it's still to be defined and determined how that we interpret this agreement. I think in the sense of testing the core principles, I think now prioritizing security sector and SOE reform has to be higher on the list. I think the peace area, conflict affected areas, the peace dividend, with a focus on making sure allocation and distribution is done right and done transparently. I think we need to focus on rebuilding trust and things with a rapid impact on people, education, health, public works. Family support program will keep going, but that's a short-term support. I think people really want to see schools in their area, not 100 kids with no books, and you call it free education, but you have to pay fees for everything. There's no free education in Sudan. Continued focus on transparency, institutionalization, but also speed. Things were too slow, too bureaucratic to get done. And strong anti-corruption commission, ensure contestability and competition, transparency for all the bigger flows, whether it's gold, donor resources, the budget, and financial sector. So let me leave it at that. And I tried to make some adjustments given what was happening today. I'm still processing it myself, but I think, learn from the comments and questions, and let me turn it back to you, Muntasir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. We really appreciate that as a group. I think a lot of thought went into this presentation and the adaptation of it also to what is going on. We do have some questions and questions raised in the Q&A section. So I'm gonna read them. The first one is, what is your best guess of annual remittance and in comparison to annual exports?
Well, remittance flows. So it's a tough question because it's not only that it's remittances that are coming in, but are they coming in formally or informally? So one of the big things about exchange rate reform was like if you were a bank and you were forced by the government to give people 55 pounds to the dollar, but the parallel market was out there doing it at 350 or 380, which is when we reformed, you're not going to get those dollars. The black market is. So when I talked about these reforms getting at some of the incentives of the rents and getting out corruption, though policies were fueling the black market, right? So it was almost as if we wanted a black market. Now you have the economic incentives are there, i.e. the exchange rate is now unified, and it's been pretty stable around 450 for a while. I don't know what it is today. I left 2 weeks ago. But you still have the issue of correspondent banks. You know, as an after effect of the sanctions, but also a lot of policies that happened as a result of the global financial crisis. Banks are risk averse, and they don't want to take risks of dealing with counterparts who don't follow the right laws as far as anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism. So we were in a position of having to prove that we had the right policies and laws and all that, and that's starting to re-engage international banks. So that was starting to happen. We, in fact, did do the laws are good, and in the central bank, we were working on some improvements on how to implement some of those policies. But there's still no correspondent banks in the U.S. that have a relationship with Sudan. So we need to, going back to your question, so we got it to about 700 million. I think it was, the second half would be bigger. I think it would be, crossing over the billions for the second half, a billion for the second half. And so, we'd expect 2 or 3 billion per year quite easily, as long as we started to get some of the correspondent relationships in place.
Okay, thank you. And another question is, how much consultation and analysis, between parentheses homework, was carried to optimize the expenditure of the 1.8 billion?
So the pipeline of projects that were being worked on. So it's actually a 2 billion program, but because that table mixed in some of the IMF expected flows, and some of the 2 billion allocation was already happening this year, such as the 500 million. And we actually already had approved and gotten the COVID project, 100 million for COVID, for vaccines. So each of those projects has a ministry team. They have to set up a process. They have to do the analysis. There are missions. In fact, the missions were there and got stuck, when the coup happened and the airport closed. There were 3 missions that were in town. The World Bank process, and then some of it's not, so there are also African Development Bank and many other processes, is a whole story by itself. But needless to say, just to say, make it long story short, a project, just to define it, usually takes a year, and to do all the homework and set up the procurements and then go to the board. It was trying to be accelerated because, frankly, Sudan needs those projects much faster than typical. And so there was sort of crash program to very quickly set up these units in each ministry to run the process, and sort of an umbrella oversight at the Ministry of Finance. All that was happening. The water sector was moving very well. Some of the ministries were moving relatively slow. Ministry of Investment was probably the one least behind on the female empowerment project was moving slowly.
Okay, I'll follow up with a question of my own related to this one. And to be blunt about it, you know, in the past, from what I've seen happening in Sudan, when people in the responsibility who are responsible for signing contracts and agreeing to establish certain initiatives don't get enough salaries to start with, and don't seem to be observing the conflict of interest rules, and therefore establishing their own companies sometimes to get fraction of what is being outlet. And they didn't seem to understand that these are even ethical violations. What are the constraints being put by HIPC or by the transitional government now to prevent these kind of practices that it seems to be like a common culture somehow in Sudan, unfortunately? And especially, again, as I mentioned, that they can't sustain themselves the right way, so they might find themselves in places where they have to violate ethical constraints.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and I really agree with the sentiment that the civil service in Sudan, despite one of the first things we were doing when Ibrahim and Badawi was still there, one of the first things was a large increase in civil salaries for the civil service. You know, one might have kind of thought about whether this was done too quickly before we had sort of shored up revenues and whether it contributed to inflation. But even those wages, those increases were quickly eaten up by inflation. They'd been eroded. So people are not paid well. The civil service, the rank and file civil service are not paid well. It's a difficult thing to do. And people do have to have a commitment to what they're doing in order to accept that and continue to make ends meet and not violate any ethical bounds. And what was happening under HIPC or under these projects? There's a couple of different things that were going on. There were a very debatable practice, but I think the consensus was that it was needed, was that there were top-ups. So those who would do the additional work of helping develop some of these projects, there was a scale set up to say, okay, so the teams that would do all of the work to accelerate and develop the water, the health, or the other projects that were in the pipeline would get an additional amount of money over and above their basic salary to avoid, to ensure productivity, to avoid corruption, and to do many other things. Secondly, there are consultants that get brought in, and the consultants have to be paid whatever the market is requiring of them. There's usually multiple times a civil service salary. But then over and above that, there's the governance of those projects and the funds and the framework you set up to make sure that things are being done the right way. So the agreements between the donor and the government, let's say in the World Bank case, that becomes like a treaty, because this is an international organization with the status of it. So you assign an agreement, it becomes like a treaty between governments. That can't even be violated. You can't even override that with a domestic law. And we faced this because there was, in the family support program, there was so much pressure from different organizations initially that wanted the project basically and wanted to do different things with it, that those agreements ended up being very useful in protecting the resources and making sure that ultimately the money was focused on what it should be focused on. So those are the three lines of defense. But in the end, there's no substitute for a strong civil service. And I'm kind of painted it in a general way, but there are very capable, committed people in the civil service that, despite being cut off, not exposed, not having any projects of this type for a long time, we're doing the right thing and getting these projects ready. And so I have to give them credit, despite, a very high inflation and hard to make ends meet for their own families. We're working pretty hard to get this stuff done.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Next question, can you please clarify what the bank means by a policy loan?
So a policy loan, or in this case, a development policy grant, is that there's an agreement on a set of policies that um, would have the impact of improving the country's economic performance in some way. Sometimes they're targeted to a sector. Like, for example, in the financial sector, in order to move the performance of a sector, let's say agriculture or the financial sector or something, there's usually a combination of things that need to happen. It's oftentimes a mix of policies, changes of incentives, capacity building, training, but sometimes resources. But if the policy levers aren't adjusted, you can put in all the money that you want, but that would then end up being, basically being wasted. So policy reform ends up being a key element of a lot of changes of sector performance. So, for example, in this financial sector, we were about to introduce a policy framework to improve the governance of the boards of banks. There are lots of people in banks that shouldn't be running banks right now, the boards of banks. There should be a sort of a fit and proper test. Is a director proper? They have the right background with no corruption, no criminal background to be sitting on the board of a bank. That's a policy issue. The process of a bank that goes into bankruptcy, historically, the central bank was bailing them out. But there needs to be a process of fixing those banks. There was no laws for that. So there's a policy issue. What those development policy operations are is a package of policy measures that need to be fixed, that if the government does it within a certain amount of time, and the government usually proposes that mix of policies and negotiates it, then the donor or the development partner would provide a grant, in the amount agreed, for completion of those policies. And so that's what we were doing. Then in this case, some of the things that we already did, like the exchange rate reform or the customs exchange rate removal, all of those things, but a few other things like the energy sector and budgets. We were supposed to, we needed to now move toward a people's budget, a transparent, easily understood budget for transparency. All of those were part of that 500 million policy loan, and they were getting done. And we were basically did the last item in order to qualify for that.
Thank you. Quick question here is how much subsidy in electricity?
Well, I don't have the number exactly, but I can just tell you it's an extremely unequal distribution. If I remember correctly, and this is all these figures are going to be on the top of my head, but I think only 60% of Sudanese actually have any electricity. But the people who are consuming the highest strata of electricity, the most consumption, I think above 1,000 kilowatt hours per month, are consuming 37% of all of the budget. So the wealthiest, because when you have subsidies like that, now imagine nearly 40% of the money is going to the wealthiest, while 40% of people have no electricity. We used to have so many arguments with people who are very, against subsidy reform, especially in the fuel subsidies. But when you look at it, how unequal the distribution is of that. So, for example, if we were to start charging a little bit more for the very, very wealthy, or if they weren't contributing, if they weren't getting subsidies, just the very top echelon of consumers, we would be able to provide resources, a small amount of electricity, or at least a lifeline of the lowest levels of consumers are consuming less than 200, where they were consuming more than 1,000. We would be able to get electricity to a lot of people, and throughout the country that just simply are cut off. And what we're trying to do is go towards solar, especially small-scale solar, distributed solar, because the grid has to be extended. And the project that was on the table for completion, or at least being approved by the board in November, early December, included some grid, but included lots of maintenance, because despite all these subsidies, there's underfunding, and the whole electricity sector was falling apart. There was about 12 hours of blackouts a day. The government didn't even have enough money for something like $30 million of spare parts that were needed. But to give you another sort of more personal anecdote, I mean, I would be paying something like $8 or $9 a month in electricity. In my place, it's not a big place, but $8 or $9 a month. In the US, you'd be paying $150 a month, maybe. So that's the kind of subsidies that were happening in electricity.
Okay, a quick management issue here just for folks on the webinar. If you have a question, please put it on the Q&A section rather than the chat. And if your name shows as Bakri and you're not Bakri, please either post the question as anonymous or write your name after the question so that we know who's coming from. And before continuing reading those questions, I see that Khalafallah has his hand up. So please go ahead, Khalafallah. Can you? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think Muhammad Suleiman is before me. If you can unmute him.
He wrote his questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I
can go ahead and ask my question.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. I have two questions. First, you may not have the answer, but do you think the sanctions that the US and Europe or European Union are about to approve or decide, will these be delayed after the current agreement, or do you think they will go ahead and do it? It's individualized type of sanctions. And the second question is, the reforms, there was a big delay before, changing the exchange rate and lifting the subsidies. And there was a struggle between the leftists within the government and the others. Do you think all these are resolved now and Hamdok has the mandate within the FCC or in relation to the FCC, or these things may resurface again?
Thank you, Khalafallah. Both great questions. And it reminds me that I should have brought a pen and a paper to write them down as they come.
The sanctions first.
Okay, on the sanctions. So there's what's on the table from Senator Coons, as he just reported over the weekend, is our targeted sanctions against individuals and organizations. My view is that the threat of sanctions is as useful, almost, let's say, as the sanctions themselves. And I think I haven't, spoken to anybody since then. I had discussed this issue a while back with some people who might have weighed in. But in my view, the process isn't over yet, right? So there's details that need to be put down over the next few weeks, and how are the details of this agreement going to be implemented? Do we have, for example, the agreement includes the agreement includes putting in place some of the institutions that haven't been put in place. Includes, let's say, security sector reform, includes some accountability measures. So I believe the external pressure or the threat of sanctions could be quite useful in making sure that the core principles that were agreed in the Constitutional Declaration in 2019 are adhered to, and not skirted, so that this isn't a tactical retreat and then coming back and trying to subvert the process again. That said, there are assets, there are resources that people know are not being transparently managed, and in some cases, maybe early action would be advisable. My personal sense is that we need to use the next couple of weeks to make sure that the agreement in principle signed today actually lands in true systemic change. And all available pressure needs to be exerted during that time frame. On the reform process, yeah, there was a lot of disagreement with the left. And, I participate in a lot of those discussions, not all of them, but my sense is that there's a lot of things in theory that people were arguing for, but they just didn't have an exposure to the practical day-to-day reality, and sometimes there's denial of those realities. We can have an argument, and I consider myself, let's say, center-left in general, economically and politically. I believe in supporting people, but I also believe in markets. Even if you're center-left, or even if you're far left, I don't think anybody would agree that you should spend 5 times more on fuel subsidies than on health and education. That's just beyond an argument. And yet that wasn't agreeable. It was just really, really beyond actual looking at facts and moving forward on the basis of facts. It was just positioning. And I think it was part of an early process of becoming more mature as a country in how we discuss policies, and the fact that data is weak. Maybe people just weren't aware of how bad the situation was. And they weren't clear about how maintaining those subsidies meant that everybody was going to be paying indirectly because of inflation. And unfortunately, that's what happened. Because the delays, the budget was very bad. It wasn't as bad as 2019, but all of the reforms that we were trying to get to in 2019 or 2020 ended up happening in 2021. And so I think I showed you a graph very early in the presentation about the subsidies. I'll go back to that. So this lower right-hand thing with the blue bar, that 2020 decline should have been in 2021 decline should have been in 2020. And so inflation wouldn't be at 300% or 400%. It would have been much lower. And the exchange rate, the exchange rate was reformed at 387 in February 21st of this year. When we were first discussing it with Brahim al-Badawi, the exchange rate was 80. Right, and then it was 150, and then it was 200, and then 250, et cetera. The process, the policies were much easier implemented and would have had a much lower effect on inflation and much easier on people had we done it at the right time. But I think everything has its process. I think frankly, the FFC was playing an extremely valuable role in many other ways. Its economic committee maybe caused some delays that we probably, in retrospect, maybe they themselves hopefully would rethink, but at least, part of a democratic process of agreeing and understanding and having a dialogue that's constructive. I hope we learned some of those lessons. I think these days people are now looking at it and say, okay, we told you so. There was a coup. But no, the coup wasn't caused by the people rising up and overthrowing those who were introducing those reforms. No, the coup were caused by those whose rents were impacted by the reforms. It's the opposite of what somebody, there's no vindication of the view that in fact, the Hamdok government is what people are on the street trying to bring back. So let's keep that in mind. I'm not saying that everything was done well. I think there are many things we should do better. and getting more help to the people much faster, as one of the other questions is suggesting, is absolutely right. But let's not confuse the fact that there was a coup, a military-led coup, with, you know, the position of the FFC.
Thank you, Magdi. And in fact, you know, I can't help but to think about the positive secondary impacts of some of these financial actions. As a transportation person, I see that, you know, they could result in reduction in congestion and improvement in safety and other positive ramifications as well. We have about 5 more questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna read them. I see some people writing things in the chat, but it will be better if you write them in the Q&A. At least you will see if those questions were asked there or not. Quick one here is, what were the government's spending priorities for the incoming support?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
What were the government's spending priorities for the incoming support?
I see. Okay. So the priorities were peace. So a lot of the 700 million that was coming from the US was designed to focus on the peace dividend. Human capital, especially health and education. It's hard to imagine how destructive the Bashir regime was to the health and education sector. You know, we talk about public goods and the need to invest in, you know, public services. There, they were taking public goods like health and education, and basically it became part of patronage. You know, how do you sell it off to somebody who's going to maintain their political support for you? And that's why I'm so concerned about the risk of going back to anything that looks like a patronage-based system, because, you know, it basically reverses all of the progress. But we were trying to work through moving from, you know, general subsidies that were largely consumed by the wealthier to a system where you've got high priority on health, education, and peace in the short run, and then infrastructure, because you need to eventually shift from, you know, supporting people, you know, family support or social safety net, over to job creation. And the biggest obstacles to folks who are trying to create jobs within agriculture or industry is the fact that there's, you know, electricity gets cut and the roads are poor in Port Sudan, and a lot of obstacles. So infrastructure was a big priority. A large share of the World Bank program was focused on infrastructure, and then a lot of the other funds are, again, going back to human capital and social spending.
Okay. Based on the deal made today, Hamdok's agreement with Al-Burhan does not include military business activities, so its profits may not be included in the state budget. It seems like we're going in this circle again. An implicit question, I guess. Just anything to comment on that, or your reading of it?
Well, so I think there's a lot of distrust now with the international development community, and that trust needs to be rebuilt. And it won't only be because of the Prime Minister signed this. Because, you know, if you wanted a sustainable agreement with the Prime Minister, he wouldn't have been under house arrest. He would be free to consult with anybody he needed to be consult with, and the resistance committees would have been at the table, and all of the issues would have been on the table. And when you then have a sustainable agreement that addresses all of the issues, it would be a lot easier to have full confidence in it. Now, since we don't have that scenario, we have the process going forward to make sure that all of the details that need to be in the agreement now become part of it. And certainly you can't have, you know, a shadow economy that doesn't have, I mean, there are things that the security sector may need to do that are purely related to security. But if there are economic activities, SOEs that just deal with normal business, there's no reason why they shouldn't just be paying taxes like everybody else, every other enterprise. And they should be run transparently, according to the laws of the country. And that's part of the process of moving from the old regime, limited access order, patronage system, to an open access, competitive, transparent system. But then you also need, I think, maybe going a little bit beyond economics, I think part of a sustainable agreement also means that the military needs to understand its role in a future society. You can't have civilian rule without security, but it's not as an economic actor, it's not as the ruler of the country, et cetera. It's to safeguard the country's borders and domestic security. And that's a respected role. And that's a role that needs to be properly funded in the budget, transparently funded in the budget, not what we have today or what we had in the past.
Thank you. The upcoming one is a really good question here. HIPC may be fruitful in long term, but in light of today's agreement and return of Hamdok, what is the quickest and best measures to address the immediate economical crisis to help Sudanese people, especially regarding the daily commodities?
Yeah, so immediately after the coup, I was surprised to see that all of a sudden there seems to be a lot of wheat and sugar and other things that showed up in the market. So first thing I would want to know is who had all of that, and why weren't they making that available to the people the whole time? But leaving that aside, I think the blockade meant that there were some reductions. And if they didn't, if there were shortages, they would have impacted prices. So one thing you need to do is just make sure all of the commodities, their medicine, wheat, sugar, and other things that people consume on a day-to-day basis are available and quickly. And then need to start making sure that the programs that we have, either, all the economic support and others, are implemented with a lot more urgency and speed, while at the same time not creating opportunities for corruption, because a lot of the delays are because of checks and balances. So I think there does need to be much more sort of urgent focus on this as more or less a emergency operation, not business as usual, from all of the actors, both international and domestic. Much faster support. And where I would go back, making sure that the basics are there in terms of food, water, electricity, and I think visible things that touch people's lives, like health and education, should be higher on the priority list. I do think as a litmus test, just to make sure that things are on track as HIPC gets restarted, going right after the issue of SOE reform and security sector reform. Because that's the best way to test, are we on track or are we not on track?
Thank you. Question from Khalid here. Thank you for the informative session. Assuming today's agreement holds and a new government requests international support, how soon can the reform process, including HIPC, SMP, etc., resume, and would it restart where it stopped?
Yeah, good question, Khalid. So I think in Montesa, you're going to answer this question. Okay, I'd see a little bit of a note, but in any case, I'll give it a shot. So I think I can't speak for any of the organizations, but I think everything was put on hold, not canceled. There are some things, like, for example, the World Bank was raising funds for the next round of IDA. IDA is funded by international contributions from countries, and I believe that Sudan was going to be a large case because Sudan didn't benefit from IDA for 30 years. We were making a case that we deserved more than, we did some makeup funds. But that was all removed. As soon as the coup happened, all of that language in the next round of IDA, was removed. People were very disappointed. They felt betrayed. People really, really disappointed. And, behind the scenes, we were doing a lot, let's say, in the government, but behind the scenes, all of these organizations, especially so the very senior levels, were working hard to build support for Sudan's case, especially for HIPC, the debt relief. And it was like stabbing them in the back. That's how they took it. So, the World Bank president just visited. The special envoy was just hours before the coup. People take this a little personally. I mean, these are commitments that people made to their face. So I think there's going to be some trust rebuilding needed. And I don't think it happens overnight, but I believe the organizations are ready, although none of that work was erased. I think it would be easy to restart and get the program back. I don't believe that the economic indicators would be the same. I think there's needs to be some reassessment and some going back and checking what happened as a result of the blockade, what has happened with prices, what has happened with budgets. The indicators we're expecting would not be realized now. So there needs to be maybe another month or so of rebuilding or retaking stock and then restarting and perhaps reprioritizing a few things. That's my guess, is it wouldn't take that much longer than, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks.
Excellent. How much confidence do you have in the credibility of the data provided by major SOEs, especially defense sector corporations for auditing? 1980s IMF reform efforts had trouble getting enough access to Sudanese military corporation finances. The situation is now even more complex.
Yeah, I wasn't in the middle of that, but just my colleagues were having trouble getting that agenda moving forward. Initially, there were conversations. There was even a promise to Ibrahim al-Badawi that there would be some $2 billion that would be contributed by those organizations. Then it became sort of, okay, well, we can actually contribute exports of $2 billion to the strengthening the pound. Then it became, well, if we get funding, then we can develop X. So it was clearly not a very constructive or transparent dialogue. And there was progress. So some of these audits and these things were normal audits were happening, and the auditors were, generally credible auditors. But going further with getting the full list was difficult. Getting everything, sort of the whole transparency agenda around the SOEs, it's a good question. There were challenges. There was a lot of progress from where we were. I mean, I remember when first starting, one of the big murky questions was of how big is this large sort of hidden economy, and would there be any light shed? The fact that we were able to put up a list of the vast majority of those SOEs was already a lot of progress. The fact that the 10 important ones were being audited was also progress, but there was limits, and there was resistance.
Excellent. We have a question here, quick one. What are your thoughts on the performance of the Tamkeen Remover Committee?
Again, I'm not directly engaged, but my sense, and it was this thing that was discussed a lot, is that obviously very, very urgent issue, the policy itself, the whole slide and the discussion about favoritism and patronage and how only people with limited access to those in power had economic opportunities. All that is the sort of the material that the committee to remove the Tamkeen. Tamkeen, for those who don't know, was the term given to the political agenda of empowering those who supported the regime, whether through top jobs or economic opportunities or assets in some way. But the other hand, any process that removes assets or takes people out of jobs, there needs to be due process. you know, information in Sudan is poor generally. And so it's easy to make false accusations. And at a minimum, somebody needs their day in court to prove otherwise. So I do think some checks and balances were needed. I think most people would agree that the agenda was right. They still needed. But it needed to have checks and balances, and in some way also, because I had experience of something like this in the Arab Spring. I was working in the Middle East during that era. And in Tunisia, the corruption was largely contained around the family of Ben Ali. So there was 50 or so linked families, and you can sort of target them and focus the investigation there, but largely you can let the economy, the rest of the economy, move forward. In Egypt, it was a little open-ended, sort of the post-Mubarak, there was an attempt to go back and reverse a lot of transactions, but it was so open, it became a sort of, it froze everybody because nobody knew who was in or who was out or who was at risk. Sudan, you had a little bit of that. So you need to be able to do these things in a way that doesn't freeze the economy. And you also need to have checks and balances. But with that said, you can't have 30 years of looting of the country and not have a process of going back and sort of getting as much of that back as possible and putting it back into the economy, especially given the levels of poverty that resulted from that regime. Just purely from the standpoint of economic justice, the Tamkeen Committee, the anti-Tamkeen, the dismantling effort is needed. It just needed to be framed, and some checks and balances put in to allow it to move forward with confidence.
Thank you. There is one question here on the Q&A session. There are some questions written in chat. I cannot really manage which has been answered and which is not. So if anyone has written a question in the chat and would like it to be answered, that it hasn't been addressed yet, please write it in the Q&A session. I will read this question. I'll ask you one, and then if there is any other question that appeared, I'll ask it. Otherwise, we will wrap the session.
Okay.
So there is here, is there an estimate of the stolen funds residing out of the country? And can these enter the equation of debt payment?
There are estimates. I don't have them on top of mind, but in terms of debt payment, so that 70 billion debt, we had a very favorable agreement in HIPC. The Paris Club, which is let's say a third or more of the 70 billion, we had 14 billion agreed in Paris to be written off, but the vast majority would be finally written off as we exited HIPC, which is 2 or 3 year process. As we complete those reforms, we can exit HIPC. It was scheduled for 2024, but it could have been earlier. We had agreements to basically remove the vast majority of our debt. And during that interim period between our Paris Club agreement and 2024, there would be no payments. So we were in a very favorable position with or without those stolen funds coming back. Now, obviously, the stolen funds need to come back, but it's not just for debt repayment. I think that I would go back to things like human capital, the peace dividend, the very marginalized areas. So if Khartoum has more potholes than roads and 12 hours of electricity, then what do you say about a place that has never had electricity, doesn't have any clinics, doesn't have any proper education, in a country that had an oil boom? I mean, it's just the inequality in Sudan is tremendous. And those stolen funds are part of that inequality. So I would apply those funds to addressing the inequality in Sudan.
Okay, excellent. The question that I had, and more of a personal reflection, when I spent time doing sabbatical in Netherlands, and I looked at their transportation system, which was very impressive to me. The thought that I had in mind is if we have support from external countries to help Sudan, wouldn't it be better to have some sort of cloning or twinning of existing systems that they have already, where they bring those systems to us and you know, as grants maybe, or even in sort of loans, and employ people of Sudan to manage those systems or to work on those systems, not really manage them, to prevent some of the corruptions and to expedite the development. I wanted to get your thoughts about this, and maybe I'm naive in my thinking here, but I just wanted to get your opinion and your thoughts and maybe your corrections too.
No, I don't have any corrections, but I'm inspired by what you say. And I think what Sudan needs a lot of is people who've been exposed to well-functioning systems, and your potential contribution in the transport sector. I've been to the Netherlands, and I was impressed. I was especially impressed by the fact that so many people are riding bicycles, but public transportation is easy and it seems to be efficient. I think having had the exposure of how that works as a system, as opposed to a lay observer, we need public transport in Sudan. We need to think about how do you make places livable, because those cities are livable. Khartoum is difficult. There's not enough green space. Importing of the influx of people from the countryside has just not been very well managed. And as somebody who's had that exposure, I think you could make a difference. A lot of people who come back, you have to come back with humility as well. I think there are some times when people come back, they have had some skills and some exposure and all that, and they expect things to happen their way, and it generally it can't happen like that. But nonetheless, with the sort of right level of humility, you can take your observations and your exposure here. As I see you're a professor at Virginia Tech, transportation is one of the most important things in a far-flung country like Sudan, where you have productive regions all over the country, one port, but a strategic location where Sudan can be connecting all of, the Sahel, and the sort of could be a horizontal linkage between lots of Africa and the Red Sea, as well as, going deeper into sort of South Sudan and building linkages with its former, part of its country. So I think you should be really keep building that thought and get ready to go help. Because eventually the people are going to set this back on the right course.
Thank you. I really meant it for everybody, not just me, of course, but the idea of really trying to clone existing systems, like you say. I don't see any other written question here, but I really think this was very productive, very informative. It was a pleasure having you. You really set the bar high. But we will continue this effort, inshallah. And as I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the webinar, our intention is building those webinars and get critical thinking and critical points from them toward restoring and maintaining a resilient and sustainable transportation system, democratic system in Sudan. Really resilient and sustainable every system in Sudan. Toward the best that we can do. So thank you all. I would encourage everyone who can contribute to let us know, and even suggest speakers that you think they can contribute to this goal. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Magdi. Amin.
Thank you, Mutasser. Thank you, everybody who joined, and let's keep hope alive, and let's keep working toward this transformation of a country that really needs it. Thank you all.
Thank you.